The Poisoning of Autumn. The fall is a poison to me now. There was a time when the growing chill and the flaming hills of trees ready to shed cooled the stresses of summer, and readied me for the contemplative crawl of winter. It was, for me, an introspective time, one of silent walks down dusky gravel roads, or long afternoons thinking over projects upon the overlooks of Appalachian gorges haunted by the mists that rise from creeks as the bite of night draws in. A time of rejuvenation for the soul, a healing that was helped rather than hindered by the beautiful, withering death which the season brings. That splendor of warm color and the scent of leafy drifts carried on the breeze could almost inure me to any loss or regret, reminding one that there was a gorgeous solemnity to death, and that it need not always be painful. But those days and that comfort are long gone. This change happened the better part of a decade ago now, but the circumstances of it are as fresh as if it had all come crashing down just yesterday to me. And it isn't, I must warn you, a quick or uncomplicated tale to tell. No simple sighting of a woodland haint or spooky campfire tale about ghosts or monsters in the usual sense. But if you really must understand why I sleep so fitfully when the winds and gentle rains of autumn taunt the windows, or why I've come to hate the damp smell of leaves gone to rot, or why I've ceased to roam in the hills when they don the fiery colors of fall, then it is necessary to lay it all out for you, and spare no detail, however muddled it all becomes by the end. It was late in the afternoon of Halloween in 2017, and I was driving the 2 hours back into Boyle County from where I lived, and still live, in Lee, to the southeast. I grew up in Boyle, where the rippling hills thrown west by Appalachia meet the softly rolling plains of pasture and grassland that mark lowland Kentucky, and it was always a pleasure to return, especially in that season. The leaves of the trees that overhung the road out of Lancaster were orange with the approach of winter's death, and the sunlight of a cool autumn poured golden down onto the winding country lane as it carried me into Danville from the east. I skirted the edge of town, sparing myself the pretentious little college row of Main Street, and then banked onto Stanford Road and drove southeast, as if to leave the county almost as soon as I'd entered it. Before long I came to my destination, the Danville Memorial Gardens, in the pasture land in low hills near the county line. The cemetery was a regular destination for me. I had come there every October for the past 7 years, and as was usual, the cemetery was empty. It was too far outside town to host walkers out for afternoon strolls, or teenagers preparing for nights of holiday mischief. Though the sound of traffic from the passing highway was not far off, the rolling expanse of the open landscape, coupled with the soothing drone of the wind across the plains, swallowed up the clamor of cars and made a visitor feel as if the fenced pasturage and long gravel drives all around were being glimpsed from some distant, slower century, where the rush of engines and oil had yet to be heard. Old oaks and elms leaned over the wire fences out toward the horizon, and here and there a tottering barn not yet knocked in by the wind stood vigil on the hills like sentinels. The fields themselves were empty that year, perhaps off rotation, with the cattle having been shifted to some neighboring pastures beyond my sight, and the grass there had grown wild and tall, laced with the white and pink speckling of goldenrod and coneflower, to sway and roll like placid water in the wind as it passed. It was a beautiful place for a small cemetery. I had always thought so, and I recall thinking so again as I stepped out of the truck into the softly sweet scents of the fall landscape that swirled about me. I had parked up near the front and took my time walking down the rows towards the back of the plot. The family names on the stones were all familiar, names shared by teachers or peers or co-workers I'd known in my youth. Many of their older forebears were resting here, Shoemakers and Campbells and Hesters and Harringtons, but I saw no one I knew directly. Only one name in the cemetery was directly known to me, and he lay in the tree-shaded final row, furthest from the open plains towards the passing road. That name was Austin Smock. Given what happened and what I'm going to tell here, it's worth diverting to communicate just how deeply this person had impacted my life. He'd been my age, and I'd known him since elementary school, but Austin and I had only really fallen in as friends moving into high school. Friend doesn't really communicate the closeness of the bond, though. I had always been a drifting sort, a bit absent-minded and wrapped up in my own thoughts, and as a result, while I kept friends throughout my boyhood, I seldom remained embedded in one group for more than a year or two before sliding in with some other knot of companions as shifts in interest or pursuits introduced me to new people. And yet Austin and I, within a few months of discovering a shared interest in wargaming, had formed a connection I've never once formed with any other human being outside of combat or other situations of heightened duress and risk. In high-stakes environments like those, men who have passed through together can readily lean on one another and confide things amongst themselves no one outside their circle would ever understand. But Austin and I had shared no high-stakes experiences, and survived no external shock or abuse in those languid high school years. Rather, we'd both had very comfortable middle-class experiences of rural Kentuckian life, and whilst social upsets or typically brash teen brushes with the law flared up now and then, you'd be justified in saying we'd led, up to graduation, fairly mundane lives. And yet, as I say, some peculiar similarity of mindset bound us from the start. When a teacher infuriated us, we would find we were both irritated by the very same mannerisms and beliefs they exemplified. When some soul-crushing humiliation of modern life troubled us, from minimum wage work to irrelevant school assignments, we found we both chafed under them for the same reasons. When an argument erupted amongst friends, we found we were always on the same side of whatever angsty divide had cropped up to anger our peers. Austin was, though I would not have had the words to say as much then, just as strange and unsuited to the cookie-cutter delineation of modernity as I was, and by some odd circumstance, both of us had come into each other's lives at exactly the moment we most needed company in whom we could confide. We were united not by danger or shared risk, but rather by some unspoken understanding that we were both floaty, slightly absent-minded outsiders in a world dominated by clockwork people aspiring to lead comfortable, clockwork lives. But, inseparable as we two societal aliens became, we were eventually separated. I went off to school a few hours away, and Austin stayed embedded in the factory job he'd landed in neighboring Harrodsburg. We'd call a few hours every few nights, though, maybe play a game together, and meet up on the weekends when I'd come back into town to stay with family. So even in different places, the connection we maintained was still considerable, and any big hurdle in life either of us faced would quickly be discussed with the other. Or so I had thought. Over a year into this separation, Austin took his own life, and shocked his family and friends in the process. But the noose took more than a friend from me. It took comfort, for it reminded me that even the person I felt I knew best in the world could still surprise me. And so I lived, and continue to live, in a sense, under a shadow for long afterward. Not quite a shadow of guilt, for I don't know that I ever could have done anything to avert what happened, but certainly a shadow of confusion. For a long time I felt alone despite my affectionate family and broader circle of friends, for the one person who understood me unconditionally was gone. Future friendships have always been treated warily, for I've never again allowed myself to grow deeply dependent on the advice or company of another person. I have grown used to bearing my estrangement from the mindsets of those around me alone, just as I did before Austin had ever come into my life. And yet, in many ways, he remained on my mind. I would dream of Austin now and then, vividly and memorably, and in dream we would speak just as we had in life, often in the places we'd frequented together around Danville and the wider county. If I had some large career or social upheaval on the horizon, or was stressed over some relationship turbulence or uncertainty over moves that needed to be made, I'd often find myself standing with him in dream overlooking the fields west of town, or sitting around a campfire as we'd often done in the wooded hills of Forkland, and we would talk all the night, perhaps about my troubles, but just as often about other things entirely, like novels or games or the life developments of mutual friends which Austin's early departure had denied him the experience of. Never would his death be mentioned, and for the duration of the dream, I would almost be able to forget I was dreaming. And through these occasional nocturnal self-projections, his voice and humor and way of thinking were kept alive to me in a way photographs or physical mementos could never manage to match. And so, that Halloween afternoon of 2017, which would have been his birthday, I was making a pilgrimage which had become accustomed to me. I had driven over from Lee County with a small tin box in hand. In it was one plastic, miniature warrior from the war game we'd met playing. Years ago, after his death, I had realized I still had a unit of 30 in my possession, which I had agreed to paint for him. Every year, as a matter of private ritual, I made it a point to finish one of the models and would leave it at the foot of his headstone. As I walked the wind-swept grass, which had gotten just long enough along the rows to be pleasantly spongy beneath my boots, and looked out over the fields that surrounded me, I wondered what happened to the little plastic warriors I'd leave there. I had never found an old one during my yearly visits, warped and faded as one might have been by the sun and rain. I liked to imagine that Austin's parents, who had never much liked me or this hobby, and who I had had no contact with since his death, might well have a shelf of their sons' painted soldiers back home, to which the sole yearly offerings were added. Or else that a few children who had come through the memorial gardens with family had scooped them carelessly up here or there, and that they lived on as the toys of kids who had no idea what game or hand they'd come from. And it was these thoughts that occupied me as I reached the end of that last row, where his stone waited, to where my legs had tentatively but robotically been carrying me. But when I looked down upon the patch of grass which had for all these long 7 years hosted his stone, I found it was barren. I wasn't alarmed at first. The grass was smooth and undisturbed, and the ground about me was as I'd always remembered it. Surely in my absent-minded wanderings I'd overstepped, and I would find my place a few yards back down the row. But then I laid eyes on the headstone of Austin's paternal grandfather, who I knew full well lay beside him, and I found I had not overstepped at all. I was exactly where I'd intended to go, and yet here at the end of the row, there was no marker for the familiar resting place of Austin's smock. I stepped back from the row and scanned left and right again, almost tripping over the next row's stones as I backpedaled. Still, my friend's name was nowhere to be seen. And then, with all the thematic, drama-rich timing of a dream, my phone rang, interrupting my search. I yanked it from my pocket, fruitlessly shielding the screen against the blinding gold of the afternoon sun, and then strode beneath the shielding boughs of a tree to get a better look. And displayed there was a number I had never, and will never forget. Austin's number. The familiar 859 area code was there, followed by the 516 prefix that had burned itself into my brain those last few years we'd actually had cell phones to shoot inconsequential messages to each other. Austin was not named in my contacts. This phone was far newer than his passing, but there was no mistaking the digits displayed there. And it was at that moment, stood there under the familiar oak that overhung the smock grave plots at the back of the Danville Memorial Gardens, and faced with a phone call I could not possibly be receiving, that I decided this was a dream. It was yet another remarkably vivid, long-form dream. Before long, I was sure to wake in my own bed back in Beattyville, my dog at my feet and my chickens calling beyond the window. But before that time came, I would indulge in the small comfort of hearing Austin's fraternal, joking voice again. And so I answered, and it was him. And I told him I'd been looking for him, and he laughed and replied I must have been looking in the wrong places, and he told me to get myself over to Millennium Park, where we'd often gone to smoke away from parental eyes in our later years of high school. He would wait for me in our usual spot. As soon as I'd hung up and piled back into the truck in a rush, some small doubt had awakened in me. Now, looking back, I can't say why the sheer mundane regularness of things didn't set off alarm bells. I had read my phone, and all of the headstones in the gardens, with ease. I remembered every turn and bend of the scenic autumnal drive over from Lee County. And yet, I couldn't have told you, if you'd stopped me in that mad dash for Millennium Park, what small and subtle things were troubling me. I think, deep down, I suspected I wasn't dreaming right from the start. And yet I was so desperate for the brotherly company I'd so long been denied, I simply didn't care to question my sanity, or perform the sorts of checks a lucid dreamer is meant to perform to determine if they are, indeed, asleep. I just traced the familiar roads through Danville across town, and before long, I was pulling up in the lots overlooking the soccer fields, and jogging up the asphalt running trails to the bridge we used to hide under. And there he was, in the shade beneath the bridge, sat up on a large stone with the soles of his boots in the water of the creek like always. I was nearing 30, but, as in all my dreams, he was exactly as he'd been the last time I saw him, forever frozen in the form of a man just out of high school, and dogged by the sunken eyes that come from working 12-hour night shifts. I took the cigarette he offered, Kentucky's best, the cheapest we could buy, and the smoke and taste was as real to me then as it had ever been. And we talked, as we always had, about where life had taken me, and what projects I was involved in, and what people from the past I'd kept up with. And at length, after an hour and more of the fast talk of old friends united after long years apart, as I commented on the perfect hues and weather of the season, he asked me a question. "You figure you can afford to crash up at the wildlife refuge for the night? It's been too long since I sat over a fire and talked." And I agreed, of course. In the moment, I was too swept up in the nostalgic comfort of it all to think about the situation I'd found myself in, and before long we'd cooked up a plan. I would run into town and grab a pizza for the night. He would furnish the beers, and in about an hour we'd meet up in the lot of the Central Kentucky Wildlife Refuge and get a fire going back in the woods before dark set in. And then we'd chat till dawn, just like old times. And yet when we came up from the creekside onto the running trail to depart, Austin turned from the path and walked straight into the trees, away from the lot. When I called out after him, he told me vaguely not to worry, said his car wasn't up that way, and he'd beat me to the refuge if I wasn't quick. The jibe was characteristic enough of him that I didn't second-guess the other part of his response until well after I was back in my truck and on my way out of the park. But I knew Millennium Park, and as such, I knew full well the band of forest into which Austin had walked abutted a miles-long expanse of scrub fields and scattered trees and disused railway tracks. There was no alternate parking lot or road that way. And so as I trundled out of the park and down Main Street with its columns of disconnected students and the strange chic eateries which had cropped up to serve them, I began, even if only at the back of my mind, to truly worry. I counted the locales and was more and more disturbed as I recognized each and every one, void of all the vagaries of dream or sleep. There was the disgustingly urbane ramen shop, the pompous European bistro with its foreign flags and its penguin waiters clopping about in polished shoes. The pedantic little pizza pub with its diner's dress code and its sneering out-of-town collegiate staff. And there, too, was wholesome Burke's Bakery, still clinging to life amidst all the faux city finery of a small town, attempting to ape larger cousins afield. On Houstonville Road, I passed the lot where my father often parked when he went in for work at the hospital downtown, and even spied his truck above the roofs of the other parked cars, blue and familiar. It was all so salient and clear, so vivid that I had to actively remind myself it all had to be a dream, even if all my senses seemed to insist it wasn't. I parked in the lot of Giovanni's, the greasy, familiar pizza place we'd frequented as teens, and walked the familiar path to the doors. It was the first time I'd passed through them in many years, and I was at first relieved to see I did not recognize the man I spoke to over the counter, or any of the staff bustling about behind him in the kitchen. But as I loitered the 10 or so minutes it took for them to ready the pie, I felt a tap on my shoulder as I pretended to browse the sodas in the lobby's glass-fronted fridge, and turned to find myself face to face with Jeffrey Gibson, an old friend from high school, identifiable to me immediately despite the prematurely receding hairline and the slightly softened figure of the sturdy man who'd once played school football for the Boyle County Rebels. He said he thought he had recognized me. My red hair had, not for the first time in my life, betrayed my identity from behind. In any other circumstance, I would have been glad of the encounter. I'd quite liked Jeff, and though we'd never shared many hobbies or pursuits in common, he was a good camping or drinking companion, and was a regular face at many high school gatherings. But then, overrun as I was with doubts of my own sanity, feverishly checking and rechecking my phone's recent calls to confirm that I had indeed received the call I thought I'd received, his appearance was nothing short of devastating. He told me he had a wife and 2 children, and a third on the way. He'd taken up the electrician's trade, as his father before him, and said he was doing quite well off it, all things considered. Jeff rattled off a few friendly complaints about the cost of food having gone up, and I had the wherewithal to laugh and nod my agreement. And then he told me he'd taken up golf over in Old Bridge and asked for my number, so he could call me up and maybe arrange a game sometime. He insisted, upon my nervous protests that I'd never played, or even watched, golf, that it was just an excuse to talk and to get drunk outdoors, and I had the presence of mind to give him my information and a warm goodbye before he left with his own food for home. And yet all those long few minutes we talked, My mind was miles away, back under the bridge with Austin Smock, racked with a creeping, subtle dread which I'd never known before. As he went, Jeff unknowingly drove home the knife, and told me he was sorry everyone had drifted apart after Austin had passed. He was the glue that had held many of us together. The comment was solemn, and was spoken from the heart. But as I agreed that I, too, was sorry, it was not sorrow I felt, but fear. When my name was called at the counter, it took me a few awkward seconds to shake myself from my own thoughts and take my food. I walked out into the open, strode quickly over to the truck, and slid inside. As I gripped the wheel and rocked slowly back and forth in the seat, I realized my hands were shaking. And then, as if on cue, my phone vibrated against my leg. I hesitated. I spent nearly a minute in still hope that an over-eager Jeff had just texted me to see that the number I'd given him was right. But those hopes were dashed, for the text was from that awfully familiar 516 number, and read that I should hurry up, because the writer was already waiting. Again I sat stricken stupid in the driver's seat of the still truck, the traffic and noise of the outside washed wholly away. This time, my eyes lingered long on the message, typed out with the same care and blithe sarcasm that I'd known so well all those years ago. It was so genuine, so reminiscent of earlier and better years, and yet the lower animal parts of my thought screamed out as if I were a beast on the trail faced by the glinting jaws of some cruel and jagged trap. And like that metaphorical beast, I lingered long sniffing the air, trying to judge what move to make next. But for all my fear, I could not bring myself to run. As certain as I now was that I was fully awake, and as unnatural as the events playing out about me felt, like some runner in a nightmare, I had a desperate need to see, to know what was happening. Was it my own mind which had slipped the rails, or was something truly immaterial and impossible being made real? These questions I could not answer by fleeing home and hoping the strangeness ceased. I am aware that many will think this mindset, this thought process, is foolish. Perhaps for them it would be. But it is precisely this need to know, this desire to experience what one has never experienced, which had so united Austin and I in our youth. It dwelt at the very core of both of us, grasping, yearning, almost Faustian. And like troubled Faust, this need was not subject to worries about risk or disaster. To us, a life lived without risk was one not worth living at all, and here, sitting in my suddenly icy seat with the threads of my sanity about me, I was faced with what seemed to me the greatest risk I had ever faced. I think it, because I am not fool enough to believe it was truly Austin I met that day under the bridge in the park, knew this about me, just as it had known, and so flawlessly replicated, all of Austin's old mannerisms. Even then, in my confusion seated in that lot as the afternoon drew ominously towards dusk, I think I had fully realized it was something else, and, faced with that realization, I had no choice but to follow it, even with the glinting trap so obviously laid out before me. And so I texted my mother and told her I was going to camp over in the wildlife refuge for the night. I said I'd drop by for breakfast tomorrow, if she and my father would be up. She replied with characteristic quickness and told me I was welcome to come. She hadn't known I was coming to town, but it wasn't exactly odd for me to revisit old haunts now and again, and I doubt she made much of it. But this brief exchange served two purposes. Firstly, I was now even more certain than before that I was wide awake, and the last crumbling vestiges of hope for this all to be some shockingly realistic and eerie dream were blown unceremoniously away. Secondly, I knew that someone would know where I'd gone if I failed to emerge come morning. With a conviction born half of fear and half of wonder, I finally left the lot with the cold pizza beside me and made haste southwest into the hill country of Forkland in the lower corner of Boyle County. Now, Forkland is a place which needs to be described to be understood. If Boyle County can be said to be the beginning of the bluegrass, a place where the horse country of rolling plains and grassy knolls comes into full force, then Forkland and the hills of that region form an island of Appalachia amidst the pastoral sea that swells around it. It's a remote, sparse reach of a sparse country, and the families there speak with accents far more akin to the eastern mountains than the more refined southern speech of lowland Kentucky. It is rugged, and like the eastern reaches of the state, its ancient hills, worn low and brooding by thousands of years of storms, are laced with runoff streams that carve jagged overhangs and strange angular shapes into the stones. These mossy rocks slumber under a blanket of old oak forest which has never known the timberman's axe or the grazing of livestock, and the bottoms of the deepest hollers along forested tracts like Quirk or White's Ridge or Scrubgrass have likely never seen a beam of sunlight, unfiltered by the 1,000 boughs that hang heavy above them. Even then, weeks into the fall of leaves, the shadows ran thick around Forkland, and by the time I turned down the way towards the refuge, it was well past 6, and night was fast approaching. I rolled into the lot, empty as it almost always was. I had held out some foolish prayer that Austin's battered old red Toyota, fresh in my mind even after all these years, would be there, a last lifeline that this was all some twisted projection of my own memories. But the shadowed asphalt yawned empty and still, and as I stepped out into the chill air of the coming night, the woods around me seemed strangely silent. The lot of the modest refuge is a small pull-off on a wooded road which hosts only a few homes. One of these homes sits right next to the lot, and given camping and other night traffic is not supposed to be permitted in the refuge, I had often worried about being chewed out by the neighbor when we'd come out this way as teens. But now, as then, the house was quiet, and whoever's cars sat on the gravel drive beyond it didn't bother with me. I pulled from beneath my back seat an old Mossberg shotgun and slipped a few extra buckshot shells into my pocket. I'd been carrying it for several weeks after scaring a coyote off my chicken coop pulling into my driveway after dark, though I'd never again been given a chance to ambush the would-be chicken thief. Now, it seemed foolish to go into the woods unarmed, for though I doubted even then it would do me much good, the false peace of mind carrying the weapon in the dark beneath the trees offered would be a great comfort. Then I slid on the pack I kept back there for impromptu hiking trips back home in Lee. There was no food and only a couple of bottles of lukewarm water in it, but it held my flashlights and some backup batteries. With these small boons, I locked up the truck and prepared to go. I crossed to the map stand at the trailhead and looked past into the corridor the trail made between the leaning trees. They hung low overhead, and the pale dirt of the ground was obscured by the drifts of leaves they had shed. I still had perhaps half an hour of partial light, but that light was weak and waning, and already the world around me was the hazy blue of day's end. The sun was behind the hills, and the depths of the woods surrounding the refuge's side of the lot were black as the tomb. I only allowed myself a moment's hesitation, a moment to gather my courage, before I stepped forward onto the path. I couldn't afford more than that. The light was fading too quickly to dally. Then I was on my way, hands clenched white about the gun, and my flashlight jammed in my pocket, not to be turned on until it was truly too dark to see without it. My eyes slowly adjusted as I walked, and the world about me took vague shape in the deepening gloom. The crooked and gnarled trunks stood black against the cold hues of twilight leaves, and as I crested the first hill and took my first turn onto the left bank of the Circle Trail, I came into a thick cloud of mist, thrown up by the pond which flanked the path. I knew the trails more than well enough to navigate by memory, and I knew where the thing would await me, and yet still, between the shade and the fog, every branch seemed a reaching limb, and every sapling a hunched and huddled stalker in the murk. And all the way along my path, as bend gave way to bend and the hillsides drew tight about me, the silence which had reigned over the forest since my arrival was never broken by anything save my own crunching footfalls in the deepening leaves. Minutes passed, and I forged further and further along the trail. As I went, more gurgling streams and still run-off ponds were passed in the hollows between the wooded hills, and at each I passed through the clouds of vapor the water had thrown off as the sun left the sky. The blue beyond the thick canopy above deepened ever towards the purplish gloom of true dark. Somewhere up there a bright moon shone, a few days off full, and yet from down there beneath the boughs I saw nothing of it save its tiny reflection in the ponds, muffled by mist. I thought of nothing but my destination, for like a soldier fleeing open ground under fire, my whole being was consumed with the need to get where I was going, with my brain dulling the fear which mandated my going. My pace remained quick, for much as I dreaded what awaited me, I needed to be there before the darkness reached its zenith, and the night truly began. A trip or stumble found me here or there, but for the most part, this well-memorized road was one I could walk even under the pall of partial blindness, and the roots and muddy sticks of the way were put smoothly behind me. And then, after all that shadow, a warm light up ahead. At first just glimmers on the eaves of fog-moistened leaves, and then, as the trail straightened out and climbed a shallow hill, a true glow of orange and red. Crackling reached my ears, and swelled with my progress. No longer just the tread of my feet through the forest floor's clutter. Finally, I came to a clearing, almost triangular in shape. A mown little patch of grass perhaps 30 yards long where a cutaway trail adjoined the broader circle trail that looped the refuge. The dark outlines of several benches stood vigil around the woodline, and at the center of the artificial meadow, right where we used to make our small fires ringed with creek stones, there crackled a low blaze, not yet burned down to coals, though it had clearly been burning for some time. Someone had been feeding it, and recently, and yet I found myself alone in the orange-litten space, and, confronted by the comparatively blinding glow of the fire, my straining eyes could pick up no forms or movement in the deep places between the trees around me. I strode tentatively out from the mouth of the trail into the open, turning circles with methodical persistence as I went, the shotgun now held level and ready. I did not call out, or entertain some pretense I still believed I was here to meet a long-lost friend. I had been expected, and though I heard and saw no hint of company, I could feel the pressing weight of observation as clearly as if I were surrounded by spectators in an arena. Something knew I was there. And then it occurred to me, that funny impulse, the thing which set it all in motion. I don't know why I thought it would work. I know even less about why it worked. Whatever more than natural thing had happened that evening, It was apparently beholden to the material rules of the world in that one silly way. For when I pulled from my pocket my phone, my right hand still protectively around the trigger of the shotgun as I tried to keep it level against my shoulder one-handed, and clumsily unlocked the screen, pulled up the call history, and dialed Austin's number. The call went through, and a noise of chirpy, muffled music rolled down to my ears from the woods uphill to my left, slowly drawing my gaze as I carefully dropped my phone back into its place and lifted the flashlight from my other pocket. I pinned the light up against the barrel of the gun and cautiously steadied the weapon as my eyes flitted from point to point up the slope. The noise was sounding from far up a runoff creek that carved its way down between two of the craggy hills that side of the clearing, before curving off the way to run parallel to the circle trail. I remembered that low cut between the hills from earlier years, scattered with moss-eaten fallen logs and the sharp outlines of 100 and more lichen-covered stones made angular by the long, slow flow of water. The nooks between the boulders and the density of tangled thorn and fallen branch were so thick that the slope was nearly impossible to navigate, and yet, due to the seasonal rains that cast down the young trees closest to the rocky banks every few years as spring or autumn rains swelled the stream to bursting, the canopy was light and seldom broken all the way up to the summit of the hills, and the moon hung low up there, almost perfectly situated above the rise, casting its milky glow down upon the hushed creek and all its many obstacles through that long hall of open space in the trees. And that paradoxically chipper music cycled again and again, and my eyes strained harder and harder upon the crags and bends of the creek up there, and with time, as the very last cycle of the ringtone uphill faded away unanswered into a deafening silence, I fixated on a shape, a silhouette, I thought, that stood tall upon a great oak trunk which rested in death as a bridge across that slow run-off stream. I stood looking up towards it for a long moment, gun pointing directly at its center, tracing its outline, trying to determine if it was just some oddly proportioned knot of wood or broken limb upon the trunk. But amidst the mist and far-flung firelight, I could discern no motion in that silhouette. Yet somehow, whether by memory or by some unknowable instinct of animal intuition, I knew that it was wrong, that it should not be. And so, with the hand pinning my light to my gun's barrel, I flicked on the beam and cast the shape in stark, blinding light. I will try to communicate what I saw, perched up there on that log across the runoff stream. But that is easier said than done. It is not just that everything which followed was quick as lightning, for despite the speed of events, the sights are seared into my memory. Rather, it's an inability of my mind and the language available to us to communicate those sights into words that one can pass on as imagery to another. There are impossible things in this world, and it does not do to attempt to describe them. But, certain as failure is, I will try to capture some slight and shallow shadow of that awful thing. There is a certain eeriness to the stares and mannerisms of deer. This is not, of course, a real material fear anyone feels. They are, in almost all circumstances, harmless. Moreover, the context in which many of us observe deer is as hunters of helpless prey. But the way in which they freeze utterly and absolutely at distant motion or stirring in the leaves, and the vacuous emptiness of their eyes, almost insectile when glimpsed distant through the verdant dark of deep woods, is subtly off-putting. There is something almost of the goat, the satyr, about them in those moments. And when a wanderer in the woods, which humanity has for centuries been growing more and more detached from, spots one like a lurking sentinel watching on from some distant tree-lined hilltop, it awakens some half-felt stirrings in the soul. Just as Puritans freshly landed feared the witch-lights and horned shapes that strode the shadows about their towns in the brush and briar, so too, in a much subtler way, does modern man feel observed by another presence far more at home beneath the boughs than he is. And that, for one blessed second, was what I thought I was seeing. Just a deer, stock still, frozen in the light's beam, and looking back upon me with glinting eyes black as coal. Then I registered its height, and the column of furred flesh beneath the antlered head, and thought that it was clumsily up upon its hind legs like a scanning bear. But even that silly rationalization was slapped unceremoniously away when I saw the far too many legs that hung from the torso of the thing, uneven and of varied lengths and musculatures, as if the limbs of many bucks and does of many ages had sprouted vine-like from the flesh, and among them hung limp heads on lifeless necks, or blinked eyelids over equally vacuous black eyes which seemed to have opened up upon the exposed stomach. A wide mouth, flat like a man's, lolled open there amidst the torso's fur and all those irreconcilable limbs, a purplish tongue hanging out in a slow pant over blocky, yellowed teeth. But to call the body a torso is too generous, for as the third and fourth seconds rolled past, and the thing remained largely motionless, I saw that it had no lower legs, or tapered hindquarters. The flesh of it, boneless and shapeless beneath its matted and slick fur, yet held wholly rigid like the length of a rising serpent, simply descended like a solid tree's bottom to where it met the mossy, mouldering trunk it used as a perch. Coiled around that trunk were dozens of many-jointed but furred legs that seemed to me to possess the poise of a crab's or spider's, and which held it rooted firm to the spot like a watching bird to a roost. I fired. I cannot say whether I hit it, for in the 5th second, just as the crack of my shot echoed up the chasm, the thing melted down into the dark behind the trunk all at once, like a snail snapping back into a shell. And then I saw, as my stomach dropped and my legs wavered beneath my own weight, a great writhing in the grass and scrub and saplings off to the side of the runoff creek, as if a vast snake was moving at speed along the ground through the undergrowth unseen. Then the motion disappeared into the forest proper, and a great crackling and clattering of tree limbs and tumbled stones sounded as something heavy began to bowl downhill towards the clearing through the trees. And though I'd racked the next shot, I was sprinting rapidly back up the circle trail with the gun thrown wide and the light held manically out before me the way I'd come before the 6th second had passed. The pursuit itself is harder still to put into words, for it is hazy and rife with the gaps and blurs of action under duress, or, perhaps more acutely, under terror. My legs thrummed on the cooling earth, and I careened and slid on leafy slicks as I rounded turns and leapt over low roots and rough ground, but I never fully tumbled over. My shins ached with the furious slamming of my pace, and I was sore for days with the sprains and strains I accrued as an ankle was awkwardly twisted here, or a calf was overextended in a hairpin turn there. My breathing was all but forgotten, and though I'm sure my lungs were aflame with effort, I have no memory of them crying out. My clearest memory, though, is of that muted thrashing and crashing which disturbed the trees behind me as I went, the snapping of trunks and the lashing of leaves as if under the onslaught of heavy weather, though the night was windless and the skies were calm. Sometimes it drew so near I thought I could feel the splintered wood thrown off by the chaos, and the rumbling of the ground beneath my boots, and other times it faded away as my pursuer took some alternate route or veered off in an attempt to cut through and meet me further ahead along the road. Now and again I would hear it off to my side rather than behind me, and I marvel now that I was not overtaken. But it was a near-run thing, and I have no doubt that some of those close calls were far closer than I would like to believe. The most remarkable part of it all is that it never, so far as I heard, made a sound which wasn't the clamor of its progress through the forest. There were no snorts or snarls or bleating brays that spoke to the inhuman nature of the thing I'd glimpsed upon that fallen log near the clearing. It remained entirely silent, entirely composed, entirely focused on its objective, just as I was. And that objective came faster than I'd expected, for the mile or so I'd walked at a brisk pace was chewed through in only a handful of frigid, tense minutes at my sprint, and before even I registered how close to the edge of the refuge I was, I noted the glint of glass at a distance through the trees as it caught the jostled beam of my light, the truck's waiting windshield. I poured every last ounce of energy I had into increasing my lead on my pursuer, my hunter, which couldn't be more than a couple dozen yards off, ripping through the brush I'd left behind me. My juddering legs and aching shins cried out as I crashed down the hill along the trail onto the harsh asphalt of the lot, and tapped incessantly the button to remotely throw the lock on my key. I must have dropped the Mossberg in the process of groping for the keys as I did, but I wouldn't realize the shotgun was gone until much later. As the lights of the truck flashed to signal the doors were ready to open and filled the yawning lot with their glow, I thundered headlong into the driver's side door, bruising my shoulder with the impact, and then desperately dragged the door wide and leapt inside. I dragged the door shut behind me and was already jamming the ignition, desperate to move. I had just a couple seconds as the engine rumbled to life and the headlights flipped on to marvel at the empty lot before me. I was already getting the truck into drive and beginning my lurch forward, but I'd expected the thing to be right on my heels, for it had sounded so frightfully fast during that final downhill sprint, just as desperate to close the gap between us as I was to widen it. Then the truck was rocked by a great weight slamming into its side as I surged for the lot's exit and the winding road beyond. The glass of the driver's side window cracked and warped under the force of the blow, but was by some miracle held roughly to shape by the tinting film along the outside of the glass. A great, rubbery limb of furred flesh sprouting thorns or claws smacked the windshield and wrapped about the front of the truck as I laid on the gas and lurched for the road, and for a moment the vehicle strained to gather momentum against whatever force my pursuer was exerting on it. For one terrible second, I thought I would roll out of the lot with the hunter attached to the truck like some gigantic mollusk, still desperate to punch into the steel shell of the vehicle and pluck out the prey hiding within. But the sudden motion seemed to rip the hold loose, and the rubbery limbs snapped back and away as the truck gathered speed, and I screeched out onto the road and away from the hunter. I flew down the road, but never looked back to see if I was followed. Indeed, I don't remember anything but snapshots of the drive home. Though it was usually a 2-hour trip, I made it to my home in Lee nearly a half-hour earlier than that. I cannot say why I didn't go to my parents or to friends up in Lexington, shaken as I was, but somehow, after stumbling through the entirety of my experience alone, it didn't feel right to rope others in, even then. For what would I have told them, even if I did wish to share the burden of my experience? The whole driver's side of my truck was bent in as if a car had broadsided the pickup's cab. I had to slide out the passenger door for the next few weeks until I could call in favors to have the thing cheaply patched up. I blamed this on an elk ramming the truck, and thus far, only a few have batted an eye at that explanation. I'd gotten far more out of my foolhardy charge into the unknown and unknowable than even I wanted, and for a time, I was for the first time in a life of considerable stresses truly shaken. Only a month later was I finally able to work up the nerve to drive back into Boyle County. Though I'd initially wished to visit the refuge during the day and revisit the places I'd been to observe what damage that indescribable pursuer had done to the undergrowth, and confirm for my own sake that the whole chase had not been some awful vision of a shattered mind, my nerves were not up to any such adventures this time around. All I managed was an excursion to the Memorial Gardens. I found that the gravesite was as it had always been, and Austin, along with his stone, were right where they were meant to be. But, much as this was a relief to see in the moment, it has raised far more questions in me than it has answered. For if the empty and unbroken grass hosting a missing gravestone were tricks played upon my own mind alone, but the damage the thing had done to my truck was visible for all to see, what then were the methods of the hunter, the trapper perhaps, which drew me up to the refuge that night? How much of its lure was mental, and how much physical? Why had it not taken me beneath the bridge in Millennium Park? Assuming, that is, that the wraith wearing the guise of my old friend was indeed the same thing that chased me through the night-choked woods after sundown. And, perhaps most troubling of all, how did it so perfectly replicate the mannerisms and communication of a young man who'd gone to his early grave so many years before? All these are questions I cannot answer. But one thing I do know, and that is this. Each October, as the month nears its end, sometimes on the anniversary of my encounter, and others a night or two before, I will dream vividly of that clearing in the refuge again. 7 times I have seen it now in sleep, despite being too cowardly to ever visit it again in waking. And in these dreams, just as vivid as those which came before, I am again back in the clearing over a stealthily built fire, warming my hands with close company. But that company is no longer a dear departed friend. It is a thing which whispers horrible truths through lips which should not form human speech, and which sees one's fears and wants through many eyes that seem to snare the soul of the viewer when met in the dark of the forest night. So when saccharine scents of floral decay reach my nose, and the cool winds breathed by autumn's approach creep up to sell their pleasant odes to death and rebirth, to the passing of season and time, I cannot take solace in them as I once did, for I know firsthand the darkness that slithers beneath such pleasantries. The fall is a poison to me now, and try as I might to recapture the beautiful acceptance of this season, I cannot shake the feeling that, in time, it will bring my end.